said that NATO had problems. Number one, it was obsolete because it was, designed many, many years ago.
That, of course, Donald Trump during a joint interview with the Times of London and a German paper. Trump's pick for Defense Secretary, General James Mad Dog Mattis, he doesn't agree with his supposed boss. Here's what he had to say.
NATO, from my perspective, having served once as a NATO Supreme Allied Commander, is the most successful military alliance probably in modern world history, maybe ever. My view is that nations with allies thrive and nations without allies don't. And so I would see us maintaining the strongest possible relationship with NATO.
Now, in that same interview, Trump also refused to say who he trusts more, Germany's Angela Merkel or Russia's Vladimir Putin.
I start off trusting both, but let's see how long that lasts. It may not last long at all.
Here's what the National Security Advisor Susan Rice had to say about it.
It's very hard to understand how one could equate Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, one of our very closest allies in the world, with Vladimir Putin.
Well, a ton to unpack here, that as well as also the war with the intelligence community from the incoming president. To help us with that is Michael O'Hanlon. Michael is a senior fellow from the Brookings Institution. You can't make this up if you tried, Michael. I'll start first with NATO being obsolete. I can imagine there's some very concerned folks in Europe right now, and clearly, as we showed, he had odds with his own pick to run the defense part of it.
Well, Donald Trump speaks a little bit too strongly at times, and I thought he had made an effort to walk this kind of language back on NATO, because, of course, he did talk this way about our alliances all throughout the presidential campaign. But once he won, I thought he very wisely and correctly recognized that as the future commander-in-chief of American military forces, he was going to be the one to uphold alliances. And if he seemed to undercut them, then that could actually encourage aggressors. Could encourage aggression against those countries and then leave us in a predicament. Okay, what do we do now that we sort of belittled our commitment to Estonia or South Korea and they've been attacked? So I think Trump recognized that kind of ambiguity or that kind of waffling on America's commitment to its allies wasn't very smart. He didn't want to inherit that problem. Unfortunately, this obsolete comment has begun to undo some of the progress that I thought Trump had made in the last 2 months when he did speak more favorably about NATO. And it's one thing to offer some criticisms about specific things like burden sharing and to say that NATO needs some updating or reform. It's something else to use a strong word like obsolete. That's a word that suggests it's done, that as far as Trump's concerned, it might as well be discarded. And that's not what you want to say when you're going to be president of the United States.
And Michael, explain to the audience why, whether it be intelligence sharing, whether it be where we base, whether we look for allies, why it's actually important that our allies think that they can count on the U.S. and vice versa.
Well, I think there are two separate answers to your question. One is the short-term reality that we have these allies and we are pledged to their security. And so if you waver, you may encourage a Vladimir Putin to attack a town in Latvia where there are a lot of Russian speakers, or you may encourage North Korea to attack South Korea like they did in 1950 when President Truman's administration seemed to waffle in our commitment to South Korea. And then you have this incredible dilemma. You've just gotten yourself implicated in a conflict that you're probably not going to be willing to walk away from, and you're probably going to wind up having to fight anyway. So that's the practical reality based on where we are. Then you have the bigger theoretical question. Let's just imagine we could start with a blank slate. Are allies good for American security or not? And that's a fair debate. I think most people would say we tried to avoid big allies or alliances before the world wars, and the world wars happened, partly because aggressors in Eurasia had no disincentive to attack France or Poland or Korea or what have you, because there was no American commitment to come help the aggrieved or victimized countries. And so the world wars resulted partly because we did not have these alliances. We thought it would be a lot more effective to avoid that kind of, utopian dream that we could somehow isolate ourselves here in North America. And of course, the Cold War was won with a strong set of allies as well. So the historical lessons, I think, are pretty powerful. Now, you could debate it for today's world as well. But again, that's where I get to that first point I made. Even if you don't like alliances, you've got to be awfully careful about how you end any of them, because you don't want to create deterrence failure in the short term and wind up having to fight the very battle that you were trying to avoid.
Equating Merkel and Putin as basically the same thing. Now, maybe people will take a position that the policy that she adopted in Germany to bring in some of those Syrian refugees was too open-ended. Some other people may say it was humanitarian, but either way, you can note that to what the blood on the hands that Putin has in Syria, let alone obviously the aggression that he's had in the Ukraine, Crimea, etc. Really? They're the same thing?
You know, this is, again, I think one of Mr. Trump's tendencies that I don't really agree with, his tendency to belittle. He's not always very gracious, and there were times where he was extremely gracious after the election to Hillary Clinton, but then it seems like a few minutes or a few tweets later, he's, you know, saying that she was a nightmare candidate or what have you, piling on. And the same kind of thing is going on here with Merkel. Now, Merkel has made some momentous decisions for her country, historic decisions, reflecting an incredible generosity on her part and her people's, her country's part. But as, you know, I think Trump recognized maybe she went a little too far for her own fellow Germans, you know, sake, for their willingness to support the policy. And so maybe she made some tactical political misjudgments based on a great sense of compassion and decency. That's a fundamentally different reality from Vladimir Putin, who's been trying to exercise Russian power in ways that have cost a number of lives around the world, especially in Ukraine and Syria. And, you know, as you suggest, as Dr. Rice suggested, to equate these two, it fails to understand that Merkel's mistakes are tactical and mistakes of judgment. And by the way, she's presided over a tremendous period of German growth and success on balance. Putin, you know, we do have to try to figure out a way to get along with him, I believe. And on that part, I agree with Trump. But let's not equate the two.
Finally, you couldn't make up, if you tried, Michael, the idea that here we are just days from the inauguration, the president-elect in a full-out fight here with our own intelligence community, seemingly taking the side of Putin over our own CIA, etc. And Putin's comments, for folks who missed it, in short, Trump, obviously given the intelligence report that we talked about a lot in this program, said that basically Brennan may have very well leaked it without any evidence suggesting it. And he said the purpose of it was to, quote, take one last shot at me. And then he asked his followers if we're living in Nazi Germany. Brennan, calling it, among other things, repugnant, said, tell the families of those 117 CIA officers who are forever memorialized on our wall of honor that their loved ones who gave their lives were akin to Nazis. Tell the CIA officers who are serving in harm's way right now and their families who are worried about them that they're akin to Nazi Germany. And he denied unequivocally that he wasn't responsible for the leak. I mean, this is surreal.
Yeah, it is. It's bad. And by the way, I'm not a huge defender of anybody that you just mentioned in that. Certainly Trump's comments were the more egregious, but I actually think Mr. Brennan made some mistakes here too. I think the way in which these dossiers were briefed left open the possibility of leaking. And I don't think the CIA did it, but somebody did it. And now all of a sudden the whole world knows that maybe or maybe not Donald Trump had prostitutes in a hotel outside of Moscow. And this is supposedly a service that we're providing to Mr. Trump by making sure he can't be subsequently blackmailed by Russia being, you know, in a position to threaten the release of that information. So instead, the information is preemptively released, and now the whole world sees Trump's character, besmirched. I don't defend anything Trump said, but if I were him, I'd be angry as well. Hopefully, if I were him, I wouldn't have done all the things that might have led to the potential here. But my point being, you know, Brennan had to be a little more careful, in my judgment, about how he briefed that information. I think the CIA may have made a mistake.
Michael, as always, I certainly appreciate a few minutes. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, everyone, when we come back, we'll bring the panel in to once again talk about Trump's foreign policy controversies, including the latest feud here with the intelligence community. We'll be right back.